The Catalyst, July 3, 2037. Research Log Entry 1. The rhythmic hum of the laboratory's machines had always been a source of comfort to me. It was the sound of progress, of science inching ever closer to mastering the mysteries of the universe. Today, however, that hum was accompanied by a nervous energy, a sensation I hadn't felt in years. I should have paid more attention to it. My name is Dr. Adrian Thorn, and this is where it all began. The day started like any other. I arrived at the facility before dawn, the sky still a deep, inky black. The mountains that encased our research center stood tall and imposing against the first hints of morning light, a reminder of the isolation that allowed us to work without the prying eyes of the public or government oversight. Here, we were free to push boundaries, to experiment with ideas others might deem too dangerous or far-fetched. Today's experiment was supposed to be a routine synthesis, an attempt to create a new superconductor with properties that could revolutionize energy storage. We had theorized that by combining elements in a certain ratio under extreme conditions, we might unlock something extraordinary, something that could sustain a clean, virtually limitless energy source. The process was delicate, requiring precise measurements and timing. The synthesis chamber, a massive cylindrical structure, lined with thick, tempered glass, hummed with power as it prepared to combine the elements under high pressure and temperature. My team was experienced, having worked on similar experiments countless times before, and I was confident in their abilities. But today, I was the one at the controls. I wanted to be the first to witness what I believed would be a breakthrough. I remember the moment the chamber door sealed shut with a hiss, trapping the elements inside. The monitors around me flickered to life, displaying streams of data as the temperature in the chamber began to rise. I could feel the anticipation in the air, the kind that only comes when you're on the brink of discovery. "Dr. Thorn, all systems are green," one of my assistants, Ellen, reported, her voice tinged with excitement. "We're ready to initiate the reaction on your command." "Begin the sequence," I ordered, my eyes fixed on the screen in front of me. The machine roared to life, and the temperature in the chamber soared to unimaginable levels. Pressure gauges spiked, and I could feel the vibration through the floor as the elements were forced together under conditions that mimicked the core of a star. This was the moment where theory met reality, where our calculations would either prove correct or be torn apart by the unpredictable nature of experimental science. For a moment, everything seemed normal. The reaction proceeded as expected, the data streaming in line with our projections. I allowed myself a small smile, already imagining the accolades that would follow such a discovery. But then something changed. Sharp beeping noise cut through the hum of the machines, and I looked up to see a warning light flashing on the control panel. The pressure in the chamber was rising too quickly, far beyond what we had calculated. "Pressure's climbing, Doctor," Ellen shouted, her voice now filled with panic. "It's off the charts. Shut it down." I barked, but even as I spoke, I knew it was too late. Chamber shuddered violently, and for a split second, I feared it might explode. But instead of a catastrophic failure, something entirely different happened. The screens went dark for a brief moment before flickering back to life, now displaying readings I had never seen before. The temperature dropped rapidly, stabilizing at a level far lower than anticipated. Pressure gauge, once pinned at the maximum, suddenly plummeted to 0. And then, in the middle of the chamber, a small glowing object appeared. It was unlike anything I had ever seen. Perfect sphere, no larger than a marble, radiating a soft, pulsating light. The color was indescribable, a hue that seemed to shift between shades of blue, green, and something else entirely. A color my mind couldn't fully comprehend. It was beautiful, mesmerizing even, but there was something unsettling about it as well. Something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. "What the hell is that?" one of the assistants whispered, but no one had an answer. The room fell silent as we all stared at the sphere, entranced by its hypnotic glow. My mind raced with possibilities, with questions about what this thing was and how it had formed. It didn't fit any of our models, didn't correspond to any known element or compound. I knew in that moment that we had stumbled upon something truly extraordinary. But rather than feel the elation that usually accompanied a discovery, I was filled with a strange sense of dread. This was not what we had set out to create, not what we had expected. And yet it was here, defying all logic and understanding. "Doctor, what do we do?" Ellen's voice broke the silence, bringing me back to the present. "Isolate it," I ordered, trying to keep my voice steady. "Prepare a containment unit. I want full analysis protocols initiated immediately." As the team scrambled to carry out my orders, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had just crossed a line, that we had reached into the unknown and pulled something back that was never meant to be discovered. The sphere continued to glow, its light pulsing in a slow, steady rhythm as if it were alive. I watched as it was carefully transferred to a containment unit, thick glass walls sealing it off from the outside world. But even as it was locked away, I couldn't escape the feeling. This was only the beginning, that we had unleashed something far greater than we could comprehend. The hum of the machines continued, now accompanied by the steady beep of the monitors as they began analyzing the sphere. I stared at the data streaming across the screen. Numbers and symbols that should have meant something, but now felt entirely foreign. "Dr. Thorn," Ellen called, her voice quieter now. "The data, it's unlike anything we've ever seen. Properties of this, whatever it is, they don't match any known element." I nodded, my mind still reeling. "Keep monitoring it. I need to think." As I left the lab, the sphere's pulsating light lingered in my mind, a constant reminder of the discovery that would soon change everything. July 5th, 2037, Research Log, Entry 2. The following days passed in a blur of data analysis, sleepless nights, and a growing sense of unease that gnawed at my mind. The more we studied the sphere, the less we understood it. It seemed to defy every known law of physics, chemistry, and biology. Its properties were unlike anything we had encountered before. Unpredictable, shifting, and evolving. I felt as though I was staring into the abyss, and the abyss was staring back, indifferent and inscrutable. The first hint that something was wrong came just 2 days after the initial discovery. Ellen, who had been working closely with me since the sphere was isolated, began complaining of headaches and fatigue. At first, we dismissed it as stress. After all, the entire team had been pushing themselves to the limit, eager to uncover the secrets of this strange element. But when the symptoms persisted and began to worsen, I started to worry. "Ellen, take the day off," I suggested, trying to sound casual. "You've been working too hard. Get some rest." She gave me a weak smile, her eyes shadowed by dark circle. "I'll be fine, Dr. Thorn. I don't want to miss anything important." "That's an order," I replied, more sternly this time. "We can't afford to have anyone out of commission. Go home, get some sleep, and come back when you're feeling better." She hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "All right, but call me if there's any breakthrough." I promised her I would, though I had a sinking feeling that whatever breakthrough we were heading toward, it wasn't going to be a pleasant one. As the day wore on, more of the team began reporting similar symptoms. Headaches, nausea, dizziness. A few even mentioned strange dreams, vivid and unsettling, filled with colors they couldn't describe and shapes that seemed to shift and writhe in the corners of their vision. I couldn't help but notice that these symptoms were most prevalent among those who had spent the most time in close proximity to the containment unit. I tried to convince myself that it was just a coincidence, that the stress of the project was getting to everyone. But deep down, I knew there was something more to it. The sphere, small, glowing object, locked away behind layers of glass and steel, was affecting us in ways we couldn't yet comprehend. That night, I stayed late at the lab, alone, except for the faint hum of the machines and the occasional beep from the monitors. The rest of the team had gone home, exhausted and sick. I had insisted they take the next day off, but I couldn't bring myself to leave. The sphere's data was still pouring in, and I was desperate to find some clue, some explanation for what was happening. As I sat in the dim light of my office, poring over the numbers and graphs, I noticed something strange. The sphere's readings were changing, subtly but undeniably. It was as if it were reacting to its environment, responding to the presence of those around it. The more time we spent near it, the more its properties seemed to shift. I leaned back in my chair, rubbing my temples in an attempt to ward off the headache that was beginning to throb behind my eyes. The sphere had been stable for the first 48 hours after its creation, but now it seemed to be evolving, adapting in ways that didn't make sense. I pulled up the live feed from the containment unit and stared at the screen, watching the sphere pulse with its eerie, shifting light. It was almost hypnotic, the way the colors flowed and changed, as though it were alive. "What are you?" I whispered, knowing full well the sphere wouldn't answer. It was in that moment, as I stared at the screen, that I noticed something else, something that sent a chill down my spine. The sphere's glow was growing stronger, pulses more rapid, as if it were reacting to my voice. My breath caught in my throat, and I leaned in closer, my eyes glued to the monitor. The data streams began to spike, the readings climbing rapidly. The containment unit's sensors detected a rise in energy output, and the temperature inside the chamber started to increase, though the cooling systems were functioning perfectly. I watched in horrified fascination as the sphere began to change before my eyes. Its surface, once smooth and featureless, started to ripple, like liquid disturbed by an unseen force. Color shifted from its original blue-green hue to a deep, unsettling red, the pulses now frantic and erratic. My hands hovered over the controls, unsure of what to do. Every instinct screamed at me to shut it down, to do something to stop whatever was happening. But another part of me, the part that had driven me to make this discovery in the first place, wanted to see where this would lead. The monitors beeped loudly, a warning that the containment unit was being overwhelmed by the sphere's energy output. I could feel the heat rising in the room, though logically, I knew it shouldn't be possible for it to affect the environment outside the sealed chamber. In that moment, I realized the truth. This wasn't just an element. It was something far more dangerous. It was growing, feeding off the energy around it and adapting to survive. My discovery was no longer just a curiosity of science. It was a living, evolving entity with its own will. A surge of panic shot through me as I slammed my hand down on the emergency shutdown button. The monitors flickered and went dark as the containment unit powered down, the cooling systems roaring to life to bring the temperature back to normal. I sat there in the silence that followed, my heart pounding in my chest. For several minutes, I didn't move, my eyes still locked on the now dark monitor. The sphere had stopped pulsing, its light extinguished, but the damage was done. Whatever it was, it had responded to us, to me, and I had no idea what that meant. Taking a deep breath, I forced myself to stand and walk over to the containment unit. Through the thick glass, I could still see the sphere, now inert and lifeless. But I knew better. It wasn't dead. It was merely waiting. I knew I had to report my findings to the higher-ups, to warn them about the potential danger. But a part of me hesitated. This was my discovery, my responsibility. If I couldn't control it, who could? As I drove home through the dark, winding mountain roads, the sphere's image lingered in my mind. Its red glow burned into my memory. I had unlocked something that shouldn't have been disturbed, and I had the sinking feeling that the consequences were only just beginning. July 12, 2037. Research Log Entry 7. A week had passed since the sphere had first shown signs of its unpredictable and dangerous nature. In that time, the symptoms affecting my team had only worsened. Ellen, once energetic and focused, now looked like a shadow of her former self. Several of the other researchers were in a similar state, and no amount of rest seemed to help. The atmosphere in the lab had shifted from one of excited discovery to one of quiet dread. I was not immune to the physical effects, though mine were less severe. Headaches plagued me, accompanied by an overwhelming sense of fatigue. I tried to push through, driven by the need to understand what was happening. The fear that I was responsible for these symptoms gnawed at me. I spent hours poring over the data, trying to find any explanation for the growing list of abnormalities. The sphere's energy output was no longer stable, fluctuating erratically. Its surface continued to change, as if it were alive, responding to stimuli that we couldn't detect. But what concerned me the most was the sphere's apparent ability to affect its environment beyond the containment unit. The first reports came from the surrounding town, a small, quiet place that housed many of the facility's staff. The locals began to experience symptoms similar to those plaguing my team: headaches, fatigue, nausea. At first, the connection wasn't obvious. But as the number of cases grew, I couldn't ignore the possibility that the sphere's influence was spreading. I remember the meeting where I first brought up my concern. The team gathered in the conference room, a place that had once been filled with lively debates and camaraderie. Now, it felt more like a war room, the air thick with tension and fear. "Ellen, can you pull up the latest data on the containment unit?" She nodded weakly, her fingers trembling as she tapped on her tablet. The screen at the front of the room flickered to life, displaying graphs and charts that told a story we all feared to acknowledge. "The sphere's energy output is fluctuating more violently now," Ellen said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And the ambient radiation levels around the unit have risen significantly." "Radiation?" One of the other researchers, Dr. Collins, asked, his brow furrowed. "I thought the containment unit was supposed to shield us from any emissions." "It is," I replied, my gaze fixed on the screen. "But whatever this thing is, it's breaking through. It's not just radiation. It's something else, something we don't understand." There was a heavy silence as everyone absorbed this information. I could see the fear in their eyes, the unspoken question that hung in the air. "What have we unleashed?" "We need to shut it down," Dr. Collins finally said, his voice tinged with urgency. "We need to destroy it before it gets worse." I hesitated, torn between the desire to end this nightmare and the drive to understand the phenomenon. "I don't think it's that simple. The sphere isn't just an object, it's evolving, adapting. We can't predict how it will react to any attempts at destruction." "Then what do you suggest, Adrian?" Another researcher, Dr. Lawrence, asked, her tone sharp with frustration. "We can't just sit here and watch as it kills us." I didn't have an answer. The truth was, I had no idea what to do. Every instinct told me that destroying the sphere might only make things worse, but I couldn't deny the growing threat it posed. I could see the same thoughts reflected in the faces of my colleagues, their expressions a mix of fear and desperation. "We need more data," I finally said, the words hollow even to my own ears. "We need to understand it better before we take any drastic actions." Dr. Collins shook his head, his expression grim. "We're running out of time, Adrian. The town is already being affected. How long before this spreads further? We need to act now." The room fell into a tense silence, the weight of the decision pressing down on all of us. I knew Collins was right, but my hesitation stemmed from a deep-seated fear. Fear that this was already beyond our control, that whatever we did would only worsen the situation. "Let's run a few more tests," I suggested, trying to keep my voice steady. "If we can isolate the source of its energy, we might be able to neutralize it without causing a catastrophic reaction." The others reluctantly agreed, though I could see the doubt in their eyes. We had crossed a line, and there was no turning back. The sphere had become something more than just a scientific anomaly. It was a threat to everything we knew. The tests we conducted over the next few days yielded no clear answers. The sphere continued to adapt, its properties changing in ways that defied explanation. It absorbed energy from its surroundings, growing stronger with each passing day. The ambient radiation levels in the lab rose steadily, and the symptoms among the team worsened. It wasn't long before the first deaths were reported in the town. At first, it was only a few isolated cases, elderly residents and those with pre-existing conditions. But as the days went on, the number of casualties grew, and the symptoms spread to those who had shown no signs of illness before. The local authorities were baffled. Doctors couldn't explain the sudden outbreak of illness, and the media was quick to pick up on the story. Panic began to spread as more townspeople fell sick, and the once quiet town became a place of fear and suspicion. Inside the lab, the atmosphere was one of quiet desperation. We knew we were running out of time, that whatever was happening was beyond our ability to control. I spent long hours in the lab, barely sleeping, driven by the need to find a solution. The more I studied the sphere, the more I realized how little I understood it. One night, as I sat alone in the lab, staring at the glowing red orb through the thick glass of the containment unit, thought occurred to me. Possibility that chilled me to the bone. What if the sphere wasn't just a byproduct of our experiment? What if it was something more? Something that had been waiting to be discovered, waiting to be unleashed. I shook my head, trying to push the thought away. It was absurd. product of too many sleepless nights and too much stress. But the idea lingered, gnawing at the edges of my mind. As the days turned into weeks, the situation continued to deteriorate. The sickness spread beyond the town, infecting neighboring areas. Media began to speculate about the cause, and rumors of a government cover-up started to circulate. Pressure on us, the scientists who had inadvertently caused this crisis, grew unbearable. Finally, the decision was made. The higher-ups, in consultation with the government, ordered us to shut down the experiment. Containment unit would be sealed off, and the sphere would be left to decay in isolation. It was a desperate measure, but it was the only option left. On the morning of the shutdown, the team gathered in the lab for what we knew would be our final act of defiance against the unknown. Shutdown sequence ready to be initiated. I stood at the control panel, my finger hovering over the button that would end this nightmare. But as I looked around at the faces of my colleagues, I saw the same doubt, same fear that had been plaguing me. We all knew this was a gamble, that there was no guarantee the sphere would simply fade away once we cut off its energy source. It might just as easily adapt, find a new way to survive, and continue its spread. "Are you ready, Dr. Thorn?" Ellen asked, her voice barely audible over the hum of the machine. I nodded, my throat dry. "Yes, let's do this." Pressed the button. The machines powered down, the lights dimming as the containment unit was sealed off. The sphere's glow began to fade, its pulsing light slowing until it was almost imperceptible. For a moment, I allowed myself to hope that it was over, that we had succeeded in stopping the spread of this unknown force. But as the last of the machines fell silent, and the lab was plunged into an eerie quiet, I knew better. The sphere might have been contained, but the damage was done. The sickness had already spread, and the world outside our lab was beginning to fall apart. We stood there in the silence, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. The sphere remained inert, its once vibrant light now reduced to a faint, barely there glow. "Is it over?" Dr. Collins asked, his voice trembling. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I didn't know. The team slowly began to disperse, their movements heavy with exhaustion and defeat. We had done what we could, but it wasn't enough. I watched as they left, one by one, until I was alone in the lab, staring at the darkened containment unit. I knew then that this was only the beginning. The sphere's influence might have been slowed, but it wasn't gone. It was still out there, evolving, adapting, and spreading in ways we couldn't yet understand. And I was the one who had unleashed it. August 1st, 2037. Research log. Entry 15. It's hard to pinpoint the exact moment when everything went from bad to worse, but I remember the dread that settled over us like a thick, suffocating fog. The decision to shut down the experiment and seal off the sphere had been made in desperation, a last-ditch effort to contain the catastrophe we had unwittingly unleashed. But deep down, we all knew it was a futile gesture, a band-aid on a wound that had already begun to fester. The sickness, now referred to as the catalyst syndrome by the media, continued to spread despite our effort. Reports of mysterious illnesses began to surface in cities far from our remote lab, and the symptoms mirrored those we had seen in our own team. Headaches, nausea, fatigue, and eventually the vivid, haunting dreams that none could escape. The townspeople were the first to succumb, but as the weeks wore on, the syndrome spread like wildfire, leaving a trail of death and despair in its wake. By the time the government finally acknowledged the crisis, it was already too late. Hospitals were overwhelmed with the sick and dying, and no amount of quarantine or containment stopped the spread. The sickness moved through populations with a cruel, relentless efficiency, cutting down the old and young alike. It didn't discriminate, and the symptoms showed no sign of abating. I spent those weeks in a state of numb detachment, moving through the motions of life with a growing sense of unreality. The lab was my sanctuary, though it had become more of a tomb. Containment unit, now sealed off and inactive, still held the sphere, which had become a symbol of our failure, a silent witness to the unfolding horror. The team, once a tight-knit group of brilliant minds, had fractured. Ellen, who had been my closest confidant, was bedridden, her condition worsening by the day. Dr. Collins and Dr. Lawrence had both resigned, their spirits broken by the weight of what we had done. I couldn't blame them. Every time I looked in the mirror, I saw the guilt etched into my own face. Constant reminder that this was all my fault. I was alone with my thoughts, wrapped in a cycle of fear and regret. The data I had collected, the experiments I had run, they all pointed to the same conclusion. The sphere was not just a passive object. It was a catalyst, force that had been set in motion and could not be stopped. It adapted, it evolved, and it thrived on the very things we threw at it to contain it. The catalyst, as it had come to be known, had infected the very fabric of our world. The air we breathed, the water we drank, the soil we walked upon, nothing was safe. Every attempt to analyze the element only deepened the mystery. It was as if the sphere was mocking us, challenging us to understand. The government had finally taken drastic action. Martial law was declared in the affected regions, and military forces were deployed to enforce quarantines and attempt containment. But it was a losing battle. The syndrome continued to spread, and the death toll climbed with alarming speed. The world was descending into chaos, and there was nothing we could do to stop it. The news channels broadcast images of deserted streets, hospitals filled to capacity, and mass graves being dug to accommodate the dead. The sight was surreal, like something out of a nightmare, but it was all too real. The pandemic had taken on a life of its own, a grim reaper that stalked the earth, harvesting souls without mercy. As the world outside fell apart, I buried myself in my work, desperate to find some way to reverse the damage. I knew it was a fool's errand, but I couldn't stop. I spent long hours in the lab, poring over the data, running simulations, and searching for any clue, any hint that might lead to a solution. But the sphere's nature remained elusive, its true purpose beyond my grasp. I began to have strange dreams, much like those described by the sick. In my sleep, I saw visions of the sphere, glowing with that eerie, shifting light, its surface alive with patterns and shapes that defied logic. It whispered to me in a language I couldn't understand, yet the meaning was clear. I had opened a door that should have remained closed, and now the darkness was seeping through. The dreams were so vivid that I began to question my own sanity. I would wake in a cold sweat, the images burned into my mind, unable to shake the feeling that the sphere was reaching out to me, trying to communicate. It was absurd, I knew, product of my guilt and fear. But the more I dreamed, the more convinced I became that there was something more to the sphere than I had ever imagined. September 2nd, 2037, Research Log Entry 25. The world had descended into full-blown apocalypse. Entire cities were abandoned, left to rot as the survivors fled to the countryside in search of refuge. But there was no escape. Catalyst was everywhere, its tendrils reaching out across the globe, bringing sickness and death, all who encountered it. The government's response had shifted from containment to survival. Martial law was enforced with an iron fist, and the remnants of the population were herded into makeshift camps, where they were monitored and tested for signs of the syndrome. Camps were little more than death traps, places where the sick went to die, and the healthy were left to wonder when their time would come. Communication networks began to fail, and the world grew silent as the last bastions of civilization crumbled. The once bustling cities became ghost towns, with only the dead and the dying left to roam the empty streets. The collapse of society was swift and brutal, a descent into madness that no one had predicted. The lab, once a place of discovery and hope, had become a prison. The remaining members of the team, those who hadn't succumbed to the sickness, barely spoke. We moved like ghosts through the corridors, haunted by our failures and the knowledge that we had brought this upon ourselves. Sphere, now a darkened relic in the containment unit, seemed to mock us, its presence a constant reminder of the irreversible damage we had done. I knew the end was near. Sickness had spread too far, too fast, and there was no hope of finding a cure. The world outside was dying, and it was only a matter of time before we joined it. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to leave the lab. This was my creation, my responsibility. I had opened the door to this nightmare, and I would be the last one to close it. September 30th, 2037, Research Log Entry 32. The world as I knew it was gone. In its place was a barren landscape, a wasteland where the echoes of civilization lingered like ghosts. The streets were empty, the buildings crumbling and the air thick with the stench of decay. I hadn't left the lab in weeks. There was no point. Everything I needed was here: food, water, and the instruments of my research. But most importantly, the sphere was here, still sealed away, a silent sentinel to the destruction it had caused. The few remaining members of the team had long since abandoned their posts. Some had fled, hoping to find refuge in the wilderness. The catalyst was everywhere, and there was no escaping it. Others had succumbed to the sickness, their bodies now stored in the lab's cold storage, awaiting a burial that would never come. And then, there were those who had simply given up, their minds broken by the weight of what we had done. They wandered the empty halls like lost souls, their eyes hollow, their spirits shattered. I was alone now, the last one standing. It was fitting, I supposed. This was my mess, my creation, and I would see it through to the bitter end. The sickness had spared me, though I couldn't understand why. I had been exposed to the sphere more than anyone, yet the symptoms that had ravaged the others never touched me. I should have been grateful, but instead, I felt only a deep, gnawing guilt. Why was I still here when so many others had fallen? What cruel twist of fate had left me to bear witness to the end? I spent my days in the lab trying to find answers, though I knew it was a hopeless endeavor. The data I collected told the same story over and over again. The sphere was evolving, adapting to its environment in ways that defied explanation. It was a living thing, a force of nature that we had unleashed upon the world, and it was beyond our control. In the quiet moments, and the hum of the machines was the only sound, I allowed myself to think about what had gone wrong. How had I not seen the danger? How had I let my curiosity blind me to the risks? I had been so eager to make a breakthrough, push the boundaries of science, that I had ignored the warning signs. And now the world was paying the price. October 12th, 2037, Research Log Entry 38. The days blurred together, each one indistinguishable from the last. I had lost track of time, my only markers the entries in my log and the slow, steady decay of the world outside. I rarely slept, haunted by nightmares that were indistinguishable from reality. The dreams were always the same, a sphere, glowing with that terrible light, its surface alive with shifting patterns and shapes. It spoke to me in those dreams, though I couldn't understand the words. But the meaning was clear enough. I had unleashed something that couldn't be stopped, something that would continue to grow until it consumed everything. I had considered destroying the sphere many times, but I knew it was impossible. It had adapted to every attempt we had made to contain it, and I had no doubt it would survive any attempt to destroy it. And even if I could destroy it, what would be the point? The damage was already done. The catalyst was out there, spreading across the globe, and there was no way to put it back in the box. Instead, I focused on finding some way to understand it. Perhaps, I thought, if I could decipher its nature, I might be able to find a way to reverse the damage. It was a slim hope, but it was all I had left. I spent countless hours analyzing the sphere, trying to unlock its secrets. I ran every test I could think of, subjected it to every form of analysis, but the results were always the same. The sphere was unlike anything we had ever encountered. It was an anomaly, a singularity that defied the laws of physics and chemistry. It was as if it existed outside of our understanding. The only conclusion I could draw was that the sphere was not of this world. It had been created in our lab, but it was not a product of our science. It was something else, something beyond our comprehension. And that thought terrified me more than anything else. October 28th, 2037, Research Log Entry 42. The world outside was dead. I could see it in the reports that still trickled in from the few remaining communication networks. Entire cities had been abandoned, their populations wiped out by the sickness. Countryside was no better, with villages and towns reduced to ghostly ruins. Catalyst had done its work well, leaving nothing but death and destruction in its wake. The lab was my prison now. Couldn't leave. Not because of any physical barrier, but because there was nowhere to go. The world was a wasteland, and I was the last man standing. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had created this mess, and now I was left to live with the consequences. I had stopped eating regularly, my appetite gone, replaced by a constant gnawing anxiety. Sleep eluded me most nights, and when it did come, it brought no rest, only more nightmares, more visions of the sphere and the devastation it had wrought. I had reached a point where the only thing keeping me going was the need to document what had happened. If I couldn't stop the catalyst, at least I could leave behind a record. A warning to whoever might find it in the future, if there was a future at all. Perhaps my notes would serve as a cautionary tale, a reminder of the dangers of playing God with forces we didn't understand. But deep down, I knew the truth. No one would ever read these words. There would be no one left to find them. November 5th, 2037. Research log, entry 48. I don't know why I decided to check the sphere one last time. Perhaps it was a final act of defiance, or maybe it was just the last flicker of hope. There was still something I could do. Whatever the reason, I found myself standing in front of the containment unit, staring at the darkened glass that shielded the sphere from the outside world. The unit was silent, the machines that had once hummed with power now dark and cold. I hesitated for a moment, then reached out and activated the override, flooding the chamber with light. But I saw it took my breath away. The sphere was gone. In its place was a mass of writhing, shifting tendrils, each one glowing with that same eerie light. They twisted and coiled around each other like snakes in a pit, moving with a deliberate, almost intelligent purpose. The containment unit, once strong enough to hold the most volatile of substances, had been warped and twisted. Glass cracked and the metal bent out of shape. I stared in horror, realizing that the sphere hadn't been destroyed or contained. It had evolved. It had changed into something else, something even more dangerous than before. Tendrils moved, reacting to my presence, pressing against the glass as if testing its strength. I took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew then that the end had come, that whatever this thing was, it was no longer content to remain trapped. It wanted out, and it would stop at nothing to break free. I turned and fled the lab, my thoughts racing. There was nothing I could do to stop it, nothing I could do to contain it. The catalyst had won. All that was left was to bear witness to the final chapter of humanity's story. As I ran through the empty halls of the lab, I heard the first cracks, the sound of glass shattering and metal groaning under the strain. I didn't look back. There was no point. The end was inevitable. I found myself in my office, the place where I had spent so many hours dreaming of breakthroughs and discoveries. It was here that I would make my last stand. I grabbed my notebook, my pen, and began to write, documenting the events of the past months, the rise of the catalyst, and the fall of humanity. I don't know how long I wrote, the words pouring out of me in a desperate attempt to leave something behind, something that might outlast the destruction. But eventually, the noise from the lab grew louder, the sound of metal tearing and walls collapsing. I stopped writing, pen slipping from my fingers, as I realized there was nothing more to say. The end had come. I could hear it now, the sound of the catalyst breaking free, its tendrils slithering through the lab, searching, reaching out. It was coming for me, the last man standing, the one who had unleashed it upon the world. I took a deep breath, closed my eyes, and waited. The last sound I heard was the whisper of the catalyst, the voice that had haunted my dreams, now real and tangible as it reached out to claim its final victim. And then there was silence. November 10th, 2037, final research log entry. When I awoke, I was surrounded by silence. For a moment, I thought I was dead, that the catalyst had finally claimed me as it had so many others. But as I opened my eyes and took in my surroundings, I realized that I was still alive, still here, still trapped in the world I had created. The lab was in ruins. The walls were cracked and broken, the ceiling sagging under the weight of the destruction. The once bright lights flickered weakly, casting long, ominous shadows across the debris-strewn floor. The machines were silent, their power drained, their purpose lost. Everything was broken, everything except me. I was lying on the cold, hard floor of my office, my body stiff and sore from the fall. My notebook lay open beside me, the last words I had written barely legible through the smudges of ink. I stared at it for a long moment, the realization slowly sinking in. I was still here. I had survived. But why? The thought gnawed at me as I struggled to my feet, using the desk for support. Catalyst had torn through the lab, its tendrils ripping apart everything in their path. Yet somehow I had been spared. It didn't make sense. There was no reason I should still be alive, no reason I should have been left behind when everything else had been destroyed. I made my way through the ruins, each step heavy with the weight of my guilt and confusion. The lab was eerily quiet, the only sound the soft crunch of debris beneath my feet. The air was thick with dust and the faint metallic scent of decay. Containment unit was destroyed, reduced to a twisted mass of metal and glass. The tendrils that had once filled it were gone, leaving behind only the scars of their passing. The catalyst had escaped, and with it, the last hope of understanding what had happened. I wandered through the lab, searching for any sign of life, any sign that I wasn't completely alone. But there was nothing. The lab was empty, a graveyard of broken machines and shattered dreams. I was the only one left. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. I was immune. The catalyst, the thing I had unleashed upon the world, had spared me. It had taken everything else, everyone else, but it had left me behind, a living reminder of my failure. I sank to my knees, the weight of the truth crushing me. This was my punishment, my penance for what I had done. The world was dead, and I was the last man standing, condemned to live with the knowledge that I had destroyed everything. November 15th, 2037. Last entry. I don't know how much time passed as I sat there in the ruins of the lab, lost in my thoughts. The days and nights blurred together, time losing all meaning. There was nothing left for me here, nothing left to do but wait. Wait for what? I didn't know. Death? Redemption? Some kind of resolution? But no resolution came. Only silence and the oppressive weight of my own guilt. The world outside was just as desolate as the lab. When I finally worked up the courage to leave, I found nothing but devastation. The town that had once been home to so many was now a ghost town, its streets empty, its buildings crumbling. There were no bodies, no sign of life, just the echoes of what had once been. I walked through the streets, past the empty houses and abandoned cars, trying to make sense of it all. But there was no sense to be found. The world was dead, and I was the only one left to witness its passing. I don't know why the catalyst spared me, why it chose to leave me behind when it had taken so much. Perhaps it was some kind of twisted mercy, a way of ensuring that I would live with the consequences of my actions. Or perhaps it simply didn't care, leaving me behind as an afterthought, a remnant of a world it had moved beyond. Whatever the reason, it didn't matter. I was alone, the last man on Earth, with nothing left to do but wait for the end. I returned to the lab, the only place that still held any meaning for me, and resumed my work. Not to find a cure. There was no one left to save, but to leave behind a record of what had happened. If anyone ever found my notes, if anyone survived the catalyst's wrath, they would know what had occurred here. They would know the truth. The days passed in a blur of writing and reflection. I filled page after page with my thoughts, my regrets, my fears. The world outside continued to decay, the silence growing deeper, more oppressive. I knew it was only a matter of time before the end came for me as well. One day, as I sat at my desk writing the final words of my last entry, I felt it. Presence, cold and alien, brushing against the edges of my mind. The catalyst. It was still out there, still growing, still evolving. But now it had turned its attention back to me. I looked up from my notebook, my heart pounding in my chest. The lab was empty, the air still, but I could feel it, tendrils of the catalyst reaching out, probing, searching. It had spared me once, but now it was coming for me. There was no fear, no panic, only a deep, abiding sense of resignation. I had known this moment would come, that the catalyst would not leave me behind forever. It was the end I had been waiting for, the final chapter of a story that had gone on too long. I stood up, my legs trembling, and walked to the center of the lab. I could feel the catalyst growing closer, presence stronger, more insistent. It was coming for me, and I was ready. As I stood there, waiting, I thought of all the things I had done, all the mistakes I had made. I thought of the lives that had been lost, world that had been destroyed. And I thought of the man I had been, a scientist who had believed he could control the uncontrollable. The catalyst was in the room now, its tendrils snaking through the air, reaching out to me. Closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and let it come. There was no pain, no fear, only a sense of peace. a release from the guilt and the regret. The catalyst enveloped me, its cold tendrils wrapping around me, pulling me into its embrace. And then there was nothing. The last man on earth was gone, and with him, the final witness to the world that had been. The lab was silent, its walls cracked and broken, its machines dark and cold. The catalyst, a force beyond human comprehension, moved through the ruins, its purpose fulfilled. It had no need for witnesses, no need for understanding. It was a force of nature, a living embodiment of chaos and change. The world outside was quiet, last remnants of humanity gone, their cities empty, their voices silenced. The catalyst had moved on, leaving behind only echoes of the world it had destroyed. And in the lab, among the ruins, a notebook lay open on a desk, its pages filled with the last words of the man who had started it all. The wind blew through the broken windows, rustling the pages, carrying the words away into the void. The story was over, and the world was silent.